Welcome all to a brand new series known as Northwestern Predecessors. This series will focus on the many railways of Sodor that preceded the Northwestern Railway, as seen in the Railway series. So that means we'll be covering a lot of ground in terms of the Porterverse's timeline of events. And we shall start with the railway who started it all, the Sodor and Mainland Railway, which lasted from 1856 to 1923. Disclaimer incoming! This video is not one that covers official lore or information from the Railway series or TV series universes of Thomas, or anything really, as it's just basically my own headcanon or alternate universe, or as I like to call it, the Porterverse. So none of this is hard facts for the official stuff, but if you like getting a little headcanon bits in this video, feel free to use it in your own headcanon. It is all a bit of fun anyways, so yeah. Okay, now I got that out of the way. Here we go. Northwestern Predecessors, the Sodor and Mainland Railway. Here we go. Our grand story begins with the Sodor and Mainland Railway opening in 1856. The line stretched from Barrow-in-Furness on the mainland to a dockyard at Kirk Ronan on Sodor. The S&M was the first ever steam railway built on Sodor, and 3 tank engines were built for it by Nielsen and Company, and they were numbered 1 through 3. Among these engines was one known as Neil, who was the number 2 of the railway, and they all wore the Sodor and Mainland Railway's pale green livery with pale yellow lining. And these will be the only steam railway in Sodor until 1865, with the Skarloey Railway opening and building a junction station at Crovan's Gate. After this, very little happened on the railway until around 1875. 1875 saw an expansion for the railway, as the line would extend all the way to Kildane, and the line to Kirk Ronan would become a branch line. And 2 new bigger engines would arrive to become the mainland engines for the Sodor and Mainland Railway. An LNWR Precedent class, and a custom-built 042 Tanner engine, which was the first design of the Sodor and Mainland Railway. These engines became numbers 4 and 5 respectively, while the Nielsen engines were built under smaller trains after this. 1882 saw the arrival of an LBSCR B1 class to fully take over the Kirk Ronan line after the Nielsen engines were demoted to exclusively shunting duties. And this B1 class became the S&M's number 6. A Dean Goods engine is purchased the following year and becomes number 7. And the S&M opens a new branch line between Ballyhoo and Norby in 1895. And an NER 1001 class is brought on to manage this new branch line, and this engine becomes number 8. The 1900s was a rather interesting decade, as it started out pretty dry in terms of major events, but in 1905 things kicked off with the purchase of a new engine, a GNR Sterling single known as Emily in 1905, who became number 9. And by around 1907 or so, S&M number 3 was scrapped after being withdrawn from service. And in 1908, a new cement works was opened south of Kildane, with an industrial line opening to it. And the Sodor and Mainland Railway sells its number 1 to this new cement works, and it replaced numbers 1 and 3 with custom-built tank engines of their design, who would take their numbers. Speaking of numbers, in 1909, a renumbering of the engines was put into effect, and the engine swapped around a few numbers, which was a little bit frustrating at first, to say the least, but I got used to it. Neil became the only remaining original Sodor and Mainland engine by 1912 that was still in service. By 1913, he was doing exclusively shunting duties at Ballyhoo and very rarely left the yards. And by 1915, he was withdrawn fully after his boiler ticket expired, and the railway lacked the funds to overhaul him during wartime. And so he was simply placed in a shed at Ballyhoo and remained untouched for several years. 1918, World War I ends. 1919 begins, and early in the year, the railway announces plans for a new express engine class, and the first of which would become number 10. This new 10-wheeler class would have been their new express passenger engine, and plans were set to begin construction in 1920. But a scandal occurred, as apparently a thief was sent in to steal drawings of his engine and beat the railway to the punch and get the patent, or some other thing. Very few doesn't know about this. But this scandal, whatever happened with it, brought a lot of negative publicity for the S&M, and the plans for this new class were cancelled. Meanwhile, the rival builders, they already built their engine by 1920, but they discovered too late into the build process a fault in the design, as the firebox was way too small for its giant boiler. And if you know of your official information, you know I'm talking about Henry, and Henry will be sold to a railway on Sodor in 1921. Which railway exactly, I will get into another episode. The Sodor Mainland Railway's legacy basically goes cold around now, as it will become non-existent by 1923. But it technically doesn't. After grouping went into effect in 1923, Neil was quickly found at a shed in Ballyhoo, and he was put on display after a cosmetic restoration in 1924. He was placed at the station at Barrow, and he remained on display for the next few decades, and will outlast World War II, nationalization, and among other events on Sodor. And Neil will eventually be sold and fully restored to working order in the 1970s on Sodor as well. But that's another story for another time. And that, my friends, was the complete history of the Sodor and Mainland Railway in the Borderverse. What a ride! So you probably noticed that the railway survives a lot longer in the Porterverse than it does in the railway series. That's because I've always thought the Sodor Mainland Railway had a lot of potential in terms of storytelling and lore behind it. And to have it be long gone by like 1901 or so is just kind of a waste in my opinion. So for my AU, I've amended that and made the Sodor Mainland survive all the way into 1923 in the Porterverse. And as I say in the beginning, this is the first episode of a new series, and plenty more episodes are on the way. And just a little sneak peek, the next episode will focus on the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway and its history, which I'm super excited for you all to see. Thank you all very much for watching this episode of Northwestern Predecessors, and I will see you all in the next one. Welcome back to Northwestern Predecessors, episode 2. Oh yeah. In this episode, we should be focusing on the one and only Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway, which lasted from 1881 all the way to 1919. There's a disclaimer, none of the information presented in this video is meant to be regarding the official universes of the Thomas brand, so it's not really going to directly link up to the Railway series, the TV series, or the CGI series, or any other iteration really. This only really connects to my personal headcanon or alt universe, in which I like to call it the Porterverse, for my own universe, Thomas. Get that out of the way, let's dive into the history of the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway. Here we go. In 1881, the railway opened to the public, and 4 engines were brought on for the railway, and these were Manning Waterloo L-Class tank engines. And among these were the first engine, number 1, Charlie, and number 4, Billy Derrington. And like their siblings, they all wore the railway's rather vibrant livery. This livery consisted of a bright orange as the base color, a gold for the lining, dark purple trim, and white for the roofing and wheel trimming. And the railway began at the city of Wellsworth and ran down to a marina at Lower Sudbury. Later on, a flour mill and then waste dump will be built north of Sudbury. And for about 10 years or so, these were the only engines and notable servicing points of the railway. 1891 rolls around, and the WNSR receives an engine built on commission for shunting at the waste dump. Number 5, Whiff, was based on the Northeastern Railway's Aerolite engine, and Whiff will remain the waste dump shunter for many years. 1906 is when talks of an extension down to Brandham will begin amongst railway staff. The new engines will be bought around this time in preparation for this, and construction will begin in 1909. In 1911 saw the railway celebrate its 30th anniversary, and so the extension to Brandham saw the construction of a new dockyard for the railway, and at this point in time, it was the largest port on Sodor. A new crane will be built on site at Brandham, and it will be known as Cranky, which became one of the most used cranes on Sodor. And the shunter for this dockyard was a rather interesting case. You see, in 1912, the WNSR commissioned the Knapford and Ulstead Railway to build a shunter based on their R46 class of tank engines. And this engine arrived shortly after, and it was based on this class. Notable differences being the type of running board, among other changes from the R46 class. And this engine was painted to a solid yellow livery with blue wheels to make him stand out more amongst the gray dullness of the Brandon docks. And this engine was named Bartholomew. You get the reference if you know you're cool. And was designated as a shunter of Brandon Docks. 1914, the Great War begins, and in 1917, an R-rated Ttte arrives at Brandon Docks en route to continental Europe. The ship carrying this engine encountered a storm en route, and the engine sustained heavy damage along with the ship. And both managed to scrape into Brandon just in time, where they were both repaired. And the engine was brought to their WNSR's workshop for its repairs. And after about a week or so of repair work, the engine went on its way to Europe after being repaired. And it actually survived the war as well, along with the ship. Later on that year, in 1917, an electric engine named Stafford would arrive for shunting duties at Sudbury. And that exact engine from the ROD that was repaired at Brendan will wound up being purchased by the WNSR in late 1918 and was officially renamed to Red Dragon. And the Red Dragon wore a livery that would later inspire the Northwestern Railway's red livery, but that's another story, of course. In 1919, the WNSR will come to an end, sort of, as the railway was merged with the Knapford, Aldersborough, and Ulster Railway and officially became one giant railway. But I shan't say any more on this, for I may spoil a story meant for another day. So, for a recap, the engines of the WNSR by 1918 are as follows. Number 1, Charlie. Number 2, Number 3, Number 3. Number 4, Billy Durbington. Number 5, Whiff. Number 6, Bartholomew. Number 7, Stafford. And number 8, Red Dragon. There are a total of 8 engines owned by the railway, and around 4 of them survive in present day. And most of them did manage to survive past the agreement period, and even into the nationalization era by an extent. And they all have quite a history, to say the least. Oh, and if you're wondering, the China Clay Pits nearby Brendan would open in 1913 under the Northwestern Railway. Just want to clarify that, of course, if you thought I was missing it. Definitely didn't forget about it, you know. Thank you all very much for watching this episode of Northwestern Predecessors, and shall see you all in the next one. At last, we return to Northwestern Predecessors. This is the big one, folks. We've arrived at the Knapford and Ulstead Railway. We're also not going to only cover the KNUR, we're going to be covering a total of 5, yes, 5 railways in this video. This is because they're all heavily interconnected. They either started out as the KNUR or were absorbed into it at some point. So they'll all be in this one video. The railways we'll be covering are as follows. The Knapford and Ulstead Railway. The tramway is operated by the Sodor Tramway Company. In this case, there were 2 of them. The Knapford, Aldersborough, and Ulstead Railway. And the Tidmouth, Wellsworth, and Brenham Light Railway. These are all railways that have detailed yet pretty brief histories in the Portiverse, so they're all going to be in this video. And we will start at the beginning, with the Knapford and Ulstead Railway. Before I continue, I just want to make it known that none of the information in this video, or in this series at large, is meant to cover any official lore or any information from the official universes of Thomas Tank Engine. It's all just my sort of headcanon, or as I like to call it, the Portiverse. So take everything you hear in this video with a grain of salt. Or you can use it in your own headcanon, go nuts. Pretty cool. Now that got that out of the way, let's dive into the history of the Knapford and Ulstead Railway. So sit back, relax, grab yourself a drink, maybe even a blanket, and enjoy the show. Our story begins in 1895, when the KNUR officially opens to the public. The railway runs from the harbor at Knapford all the way up to the mountainy village of Ulstead. At this time, the railway served just a coal mine, a stone quarry, and a gold mine, which was joint operated by the Mid-Sodor Railway. And Bertram was the MSR shunter for this gold mine, and he remained there for a good amount of years. At this time, the railway operated a handful of vertical boiler coffee pot engines, one of which was named Glynn. Glynn, like the rest of the engines on this railway at the time, wore the railway's red livery with gold and black trim. These engines in livery will later be dubbed as the first generation of engines in livery colors. We'll cut away from the Knapford and Ulstead for a little bit and focus on the Sodor Tramway Company. In 1903, the Tramway Company opens its first tramway north of the KNUR. This tramway will run from Callan to Arlesdale End. And this tramway will operate a handful of then-new C-53 tram engines, one of which was indeed Toby. In 1905, the company will open a second tramway, which will operate within the powerhouse city of Great Waterton. This tramway was never connected to any railways on Sodor at this time, and it was mostly self-contained. Great Waterton was a city that was located northeast of Ulstead, and resided alongside a river that will help the city grow. And the Sodor Tramway Company will also operate light river work alongside the tramway. At this time, Great Waterton was the largest city on Sodor, and was almost deemed the capital of the island as well. and this tramway will also operate a handful of severely treated tram engines. Except in this case, they will actually have the full skirt covering on the sides, as it runs through cities with pedestrians. Sadly, these tramways will basically go non-existent within the next few years, but I'm getting better ahead of myself. So I'll come back to the Natford Offset Railway. In 1910, the KNUR rolls out its first ever class of house-built engines, the R46 class. These 060 tank engines would take over the workload for the coffee pots. One of these engines was indeed Thomas, who was actually the first one built. And this second generation of engines will wear either a Viridian livery with white lining for passenger work, or if you were a goods engine, you will receive a black livery with Viridian lining. Two of the R46s were assigned to passenger duties, while the other two were assigned to goods work, Thomas being a passenger engine in this case. In the coffee pot engines, meanwhile, will be sidelined to almost exclusively shunting work. In 1912, the Sodor Tramway Company sells its larger tramway to the KNUR, and the KNUR takes on a new name after it buys it, the Natford, Alsborough, and Offset Railway. The main R46 livery also receives some updates, most notably the brass domes. And the KNUR will build a new main line that will connect Natford to Callan by rail. This is when Lower Tidmouth, and Hultra stations will be built. And the railway will also purchase its first ever express engine, which was one of the first of its kind in Sodor. What is presently day a D16 named Molly. Molly will become the first ever express engine to run on this railway, and was painted into a bright yellow livery with red lining. And Molly will remain the railway's express engine for many years. In 1914, World War I begins, and a decent amount of events unfold during the war. In 1915, the Sodor Tramway Company will go fully bankrupt and close down after the majority of Great Wharton's residents will go off to fight in the war. With the tramway serving virtually nobody, the tramway will be forced to shut down along with the company. And the town will be fully abandoned by around 1916. Also in 1916, Tidmouth Harbor was opened as a means of relieving some of the workload from Natford Harbor, which at this time was being absolutely bombarded by shipping at the time. By around 1917 or so, Glynn was the only remaining coffee pot engine on the KNUR. 1918 sees World War I come to a close. In December of that year, the KNUR merges with the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway, and becomes one new railway, the Tidmouth, Wellsworth, and Brandon Light Railway. This railway will connect via a middle station at Crosby, and the railway will also repaint most of their engines into new liveries. The main livery being a teal livery with gold lining and red wheels and frames. In 1919, a 440 tender engine known as Edward was purchased to help with express work, and was just repainted into this new livery. And the Tidmouth, Wellsworth, and Brandon Light Railway's express service will now start at Callan, travel down to Natford, and go down all the way to the tip of the peninsula at Brendam. And Molly and Edward were juggled to express back and forth between them at this time, with Molly being the mostly primary engine at this time. In 1921, a new engine was purchased by the railway. This engine was supposed to be the main new express engine, but it turned out to be a dud as it had several steaming issues. And if you know your Sudbury history, you know this engine happened to be Henry. Henry was traveling express when he arrived, but ultimately failed with the express, but he did succeed with local trains, so he was designated to those. But Henry's steaming issues would be a thorn in his side for a number of years. But regardless of this, the railway kept him on. The Tidmouth, Wellsworth, and Brandon Light Railway would come to an end in 1923. If you know your railway history in the UK in particular, you know that in this year this is when grouping of Britain's railways will go into effect. At this time, there were a total of just 2 standard gauge railways on Sodor, the Tidmouth, Wellsworth, and Brandon Light Railway, and the Sodor and Mainland Railway. And these two will merge into one giant railway, the North Western Railway. And that railway will become one of the big 5 railways of the United Kingdom. But that is a story for another day. Oh boy, that was a big one. We have now covered the history of 5 different railways in one video. What a joyride. This means we have now covered every standard gauge railway that preceded the NWR. Before this series ends, I just want to thank you all for the support in this series. This is now one of the most popular series on my channel. I always appreciate the support. Thank you all very much for watching this episode of Northwestern Predecessors, and I'll see you all in the next one.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.